Okay, let's get started. We don't want to punish people for being on time. Tonight is the second of our 4 sessions on the borders of Israel in modern times. And I want to begin like I did last time by addressing just the pre-modern part of the equation. Tonight we're going to talk about the northern and northeastern borders, where Israel abuts with Lebanon and Syria. If we go to the Tanakh and ask ourselves, what is the northernmost reaches of Eretz Yisrael according to the Bible, what will you tell me?
As far as Lebanon and Syria?
Well, you're answering about, practically speaking, how far did the kingdom of Israel go? But if we look at biblical promises in the abstract, divine promises, what does it say there?
Euphrates?
Ad hanahar agadol nahar prat, so the great river, the Euphrates River. All right, or Ad hanahar, the river, which always means the Euphrates. In other biblical passages, we have Ad rechov levo chamat, until the road to Chamat, up in the north somewhere. And elsewhere, when we discuss the actual residential area of Israelites, it's Midan va'ad Beersheba, from Dan until Beersheba in the south. So Dan, somewhere, the Golan Heights roughly. That's what we find in the biblical promises. But what about in the biblical stories, Book of Kings, Sefer Malachim, where are the kingdoms that are beyond the reach of the united monarchy, the Davidic Solomonic united monarchy? The answer is the coastal cities of Lebanon are not in the kingdom. How do we know that? Because Hiram of Tyre, Hiram Melech Tzor, is Shlomo's ally, but he's an independent king. And where is that located? If you look at the first map, you'll see Acre, which is Akko, is already out of the kingdom of Israel, and Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, so on. It's in the Phoenician states. Well, where was the border then? If you know your Sefer Malachim, what did Shlomo give to Hiram as a payment for all the gold and cedar trees that were given to him? What did he give back in return? Esrim Ir, 20 cities. And what was the quality of those cities? It was poor, and they were in the Galilee. And Hiram referred to them as Eretz Kabul, not Kabul like Afghanistan, but Eretz Kabul. That's what the Tanakh refers to them as. So somewhere in the Galilee, or just north of the Galilee, was another kingdom, another land. Not all the way up to the Euphrates River. All right. Well, that takes us through the Tanakh. What about in Talmudic and Halachic literature? So what is Syria? Syria. What is Syria? Well, it's Syria. Okay, it's the Hebrew for Syria. But in Halachic parlance, what is the significance of Syria? Does anyone know? Is it part of Eretz Yisrael or not? It's a trick question. It's a little bit yes and a little bit no. It's considered a kibush yachid, an individual's conquest, not a kibush rabim. What's the difference? A kibush rabim is a communal conquest of the lands of the 7 Canaanite nations and whatever is beyond the area of the 7 Canaanite nations, and has the status of Eretz Yisrael for all Torah purposes, agricultural laws, mitzvot hatuliyot ba'aretz. But if you have a private conquest, it doesn't count for kiddushat Eretz Yisrael, the sanctity of the Holy Land. And King David went off and conquered a section of Syria, so to speak, and that was known as a separate land, semi-Eretz Yisrael. Not fully, but partially considered Eretz Yisrael. Where is that? Roughly speaking, it's the Golan Heights. Okay, so sometimes history repeats itself. All right, let's go to more modern times. So flip the page, and now we're looking at the big, intimidating-looking map of Sykes-Picot. Well, the Ottoman Empire controlled Eretz Yisrael in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, at a time when the Zionist movement was getting started. And the Zionist movement had territorial aspirations that we don't talk much about anymore because history has moved on, and wars and UN resolutions and treaties have overtaken whatever might have been the original aspirations. And I'm sorry I didn't print out the map again of that particular map, but I'll show it to you on my phone here. You can see it on your own phones if you like. You just type in on Google Images, Zionist Territorial Aspirations 1919, and you'll see that included in that map is part of South Lebanon, okay? Sidon, Vitzur, Sidon and Tyre are in the area that was requested at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to be included in a Jewish state. Now, also included was part of Jordan, almost up to the Hijaz Railway, the Islamic Railway to Mecca. But the idea that South Lebanon and the Golan Heights, almost up to Damascus, should be part of Zionist territorial aspirations is because at one time or another these territories were part of some Israelite kingdom of old and therefore should be recovered in the Israelite kingdom of today. The reality will be otherwise. Who determines the borders? The answer, of course, are the great powers. The great powers will determine where the national borders will be, and it doesn't matter that in ancient days, your people had a kingdom that extended far and wide to this or that direction. Okay, so let's look at this intimidating map. Sykes-Picot of 1916. Remember that during World War I, the British made a lot of promises, contradictory promises. Hussein McMahon correspondence made promises to the Arabs. The Balfour Declaration made promises to the Jews. But Sykes-Picot was a British-French deal to carve up largely what remained of the Ottoman Empire, with some of it going to an independent Arab state under British protection, some going to an independent Arab state under French protection, some just being under French rule, some being under British rule. And the area that you see as A is the area to go under French rule. Okay, the area you see as B would be to go under British rule. So if you look at the area along the Mediterranean coast, you'll see a yellow section. A yellow section and then a reddish section or a pink section near Haifa. The yellow section was an international zone, not to be dominated exclusively by any one of the powers. That area is most of today's Israel and the West Bank. Although not the Negev, interestingly. The Negev was reserved for British rule to be connected to Egypt and Jordan. But if you look at the line separating A and B, where the yellow and the blue come together, what do you notice about a sharp feature of that line that's not true on today's maps? It's very straight and angled in which way? It goes from northwest to southeast, cutting across what lake? The Kinneret. All right, so is the border of Israel today like that? Not at all. Not at all. In fact, the border looks considerably different. We'll get to that. So had this Sykes-Picot agreement been implemented as it was originally conceived, the state of Israel might never have come into existence, first of all, but even if the Zionist movement had diplomatic success over the years and the Yishuv grew, it would have grown in very different boundaries. And what is today, certainly the Golan Heights, but the Eastern Galilee would not have been part of Israel. And possibly the area of Haifa and Akko would have been some international realm and not part of the state. Also, the Negev would have been part of Jordan or Egypt and not part of a mandate for Palestine. So the Sykes-Picot agreement was a very bad agreement as far as the Zionist movement was concerned, not only because it doesn't give any promises to the Jews and contradicts later promises to the Jews, but also because the borders that are delineated are insufficient to satisfy Jewish needs if there will be, in fact, a Jewish state at some point. So this map, Baruch Hashem, this map amounted to nothing. All right? Okay. Any questions?
What's the blue?
Okay, so the blue was going to be an Arab state under French domination. And A was going to be just French rule. Yeah.
That's a lot of blue.
And I'm curious, I know that Aleppo used to be called Little Jerusalem, so
Yep.
where does that fall into it?
Aleppo was up in the yonder in Syria, where there was a large Jewish community, until there wasn't on November 29th, 1947, when it all came crashing down after the partition plan. Okay.
The yellow was.
The yellow was supposed to not be dominated either by the British or the French, but by some combination of international forces. In the end, that didn't come to pass. Okay, 1916.
1916.
Okay, yeah, during the war. Well, let's flip the page and turn to the northern border, 1920 to 1923. So, the map you're looking at represents two different attempts to delineate the border between the British mandate for Palestine and the French mandate for Lebanon, Syria. The red line, the blue line, was the earlier line in 1920. And if you notice, what area is included in the Palestine mandate that ultimately would not be part of the State of Israel upon its founding? A chunk of the Golan Heights. Not the totality of the Golan Heights, but a significant chunk of the Golan would have been in Palestine and therefore eventually Israel. But what would have been removed from Israel? Half of the Kinneret. The border would have run right down the middle of the lake. And there would also have been minor differences along the Lebanese border, with the blue line of 1920 cutting a little further south than the Kfar Baram near the red line. So the blue line was never seriously implemented. The French and the British did not do a good job of controlling their territory and policing borders in the early 1920s. Then in 1923, they decided to get serious about it and really demarcate the border properly with stones, with monument markers along the way, and make sure that on the maps it was clear who owns what parcel of land. And that is the red line. The red line again puts the Golan Heights in the Syrian side, the French side of the border, and puts the entirety of the Kinneret and the entirety of the Hula Lake, which no longer exists, in Palestine/Israel. That will play an important role in the War of Independence, a very important role in the War of Independence, because Israel's policy will be that whatever is included in British Mandate Palestine necessarily should be in the Jewish state. And any attempt by a foreign actor, like the Syrian army, to thrust its way into what is our territory will be repelled at all costs. Not always successfully, and that's why there were DMZs, which we'll get to soon enough in the next maps. But this border of 1923 was known as the Paulé-Nukam Agreement between the French and the British, and this is what determined, ultimately, Israel's borders. A deal struck between a British officer and a French officer in 1923, that is what determined the borders of the State of Israel. Not more than any other event or map or agreement, the 1923 agreement equals the borders of the State of Israel. Your average Israeli never heard of this. Your average Jew doesn't know this. Okay, like I said last week about the border with Egypt. Why is the border with Egypt where it is? Because of a 1906 agreement between the Ottomans and the British. Your average Jew, your average Israeli knows nothing about this, why their borders are where they are. So 1923 becomes the 1949 border with minor adjustments, and remains the official border to this day, outside of Israel's annexation of the Golan, which we'll talk about in about 15 minutes. Okay.
So, did this map have a name?
The Paulé-Nukam Agreement.
Paulé.
Yeah. P-A-U-L-E-T-N-E-W-C-O-M-B-E. You could look it up on, there are JSTOR articles, there's a Wikipedia article. You could read it, in a couple of minutes, you get a gist of it.
So is this on Jordan River? Like, what's demarcating the border?
So, for some of this area, the Jordan does serve as a border, but not for most of it. In other places, it's a random tree, a random path, a random village that they decided this is where we're going to have it. Water was a factor. Water was a factor in having the original border of 1920 go further east. so that the water sources that were going to feed the Galilee would be in Palestinian territory rather than Syrian territory. But guess what? The villagers who lived on the other side of the border say, but that water feeds us as well. We want it. So there's no good, compelling reason to give the bulk of the water resources to one side over the other. You want to be equitable, but remember, these are two international powers fighting over it. So it's not as though one administrative system is looking to satisfy all of its constituents. Each side is pulling in its own direction. Okay, I actually have another map that I didn't print out for everyone. Here, this is a Times of London article from 1920, October of 1920, where it says Sykes-Picot line, which was this one with the sharp turn to the southeast, from the northwest to the southeast. But then it has a suggested line, which is over here, and then it has a maximum demand over here, which would have put a lot more territory into the Palestinian side of the line, going fairly north into Lebanon and pretty far over into the Golan, up to the Jordanian border. So the British Foreign Office was looking to have maximalist demands, but in the end they didn't get everything they wanted. They got some of what they wanted, but not all of what they wanted. And to the extent that the British were successful between 1920 and 23, that represents Jewish success, because in the long run it means a Jewish state in larger territory. Yeah?
What ultimately became the Sheva Farm controversy?
Okay, so the Sheva Farm controversy relates not directly to the 1920 and 23 discussion, but rather to behavior by the Lebanese and Syrian authorities between the 1940s and the 1960s over who administered an area that pretty much everyone agrees on the maps belongs to Lebanon, but bureaucratically was being handled by Syria. And when we get to, we'll discuss it this evening, what the Israeli position is, what the Lebanese position is, and what the Syrian position is, which is irrelevant because they're out of the picture at this point. Okay, now let's go to 1948. In 1948, Israel goes to war. Well, during the war, Israel invades Lebanon. This is not a widely known aspect of the war, but for those who studied the history of the war, they know it. Israel invaded Lebanon because the Arab Liberation Army, which was operating in the Galilee, was causing trouble, and they needed to be pushed out north of the border. In the process of the invasion of Lebanon, Israel occupied 14 villages over the line. And the question was whether or not Israel had any intention of ending the war with some kind of a ceasefire and still holding foreign territory, meaning was Israel an expansionist power in the Middle East in the 1948 war? And the answer is yes, vis-a-vis the West Bank. No, vis-a-vis Egypt and Lebanon. Israel had no intention of retaining territory beyond the line. It was simply a matter of military tactics to be undone in some kind of an armistice agreement. However, Israel, during the peace negotiations on the island of Rhodes in the winter, spring of 1949, made an attempted linkage. Linkage in diplomatic affairs is always risky business. You link one thing to another thing and say, if I can't have this and this, I'm not going to even get this. It's very dangerous to do that, and in the end, they didn't, but they attempted it. What was the linkage? In the War of Independence, the Lebanese army conquered not 1 inch of Israeli territory, but Israel took part of Lebanon. A small sliver, but something. Syria invaded Israel. Israel did not take 1 inch of Syrian territory, but Syria did take some of Israeli territory and could not be budged from those positions. So, when the war came to an end, the thinking was that the Syrian-held territories in what had been British Mandate Palestine would become either Syrian enclaves that Israel would just have to deal with, suck it up, or become demilitarized zones. But Ben-Gurion and his negotiators did not like that idea of losing land to the enemy. So they said, you know what? We'll withdraw from Lebanon if Syria withdraws from Israel. How do you like that? Does that work? Does that work? That kind of linkage? No, it doesn't work. You know why it doesn't work? Because every Arab country is in it for themselves. There's no unified Arab front. There's no, okay, we'll have to capitulate here in order to get there. Each country is an entity unto itself and looking out only for its own interests. The Syrians couldn't care less whether Israel withdraws from Lebanon. They took a toehold in Israel. They want to keep their forces there, or at least at minimum, get a demilitarized zone out of it and keep Israeli forces away and have the glory of spoiling the Zionist victory ever so slightly. So in the end, Israel decided, you know what, we're going to withdraw back to the line. What line? The 1949 boundary between Israel and Lebanon, it was agreed in the armistice, would be the 1923 border, with minor rectification. The reason why the border had to be slightly adjusted was because the original line did not take into account defensive posture, military defensive posture. Think about it. The British and the French were not at war with each other. They were just drawing a line on a map, geography be damned,